what's different today than 5 years ago? What changed for you? And I think that's a really important part of it, is recognizing that the person we are at work is a full, complete person. Right. And so, we might look at our work journey and go, well, I'm still on the path. I just got promoted a couple of years ago, whatever. But what's actually going on in your full life? And that often shifts our things like our values and our purpose and that stuff. And that's where you can start to work through it. And do you have to always rip the Band-Aid off? No. I knew I was prepared to do it, but there's dozens of different ways you can start to take steps. But I think the most important thing is that self-awareness of what's actually causing me to feel misaligned.
Yeah, 100%. And I would agree with you that I think the way it shows up for a lot of people is that, but a lot of it's like, what am I doing? What kind of impact am I having? And and kind of that exploration of what kind of impact do I want to have? Hey everybody, welcome to Finding the Upside. I'm so happy you chose to join me today. I'm here in the studio today and I have a special guest, TJ Bennett. Say hi, TJ.
Hey everybody.
I want to tell you a little bit about TJ and the work that he does, and then I'm going to turn it over to him to elaborate on his journey and what he does. TJ I love reading this bio because it's very whimsical. It's very quirky, which I love. TJ is a coach, creator, and a chief DeSuckifier. He has a podcast called DeSuckify Work, as well as a newsletter. And we're very aligned in that because if you listen here, my mission is to change the world of work forever. But TJ is a coach and works with people to help them find their purpose and how to have more impact. He is very obsessed with a few things: cats, Snoopy, and desuckifying work. He spends his days listening intently to clients, helping them uncover insights that spark life-altering possibilities and opening up them to more and how to find their purpose. And I am so happy for him to join me today because we are super aligned. I was on his podcast and we talked a lot about these topics of desuckifying work and changing the way we work and everything about that. But I'm going to turn it over to TJ to elaborate on your journey and the work that you do. Thanks so much for joining me.
Awesome. I'm so happy to be here, Maria. I mean, we had so much fun on my show, and I'm excited to dig into stuff maybe from a slightly different angle today.
Yeah.
I mean, the bio, touches on it, but so I did most of my career. I worked in advertising on the creative side. Maybe that influences why I like to have my bio be a little on the quirky side.
Sure.
But I worked for ad agencies primarily for about 25 years. And towards the latter part of that career, found myself becoming more and more, I guess obsessed is the right word, with the sort of coaching side of it, leadership, mentorship, and really helping people find their purpose, find their way through their careers, not even just within the agency I'd be working at, but more bigger picture. What are you looking for? And so I started doing some coaching work, probably the last 3 or 4 years of my advertising career, kind of on the side. And finally I said, this is what I should be doing full time. I mean, I just was like, I don't know if there was a sign, but it was felt deeply in my gut.
Yeah.
And so I ripped the Band-Aid off, quit a full-time job, and the paycheck, and dove headfirst into coaching. And now I work with, executives and other leaders, rising leaders, folks who are trying to make their own work experience not suck. Or sometimes I work with a company who says, we could do better, and let's try to do that.
Yeah. I love that. And I also love, like, in all of our conversations, not just in the podcast episode we recorded for DeSuckify Work, but also in our pre-chat, we talked a lot about just the journey of that and, the holding the space for those conversations, which I think, you and I agree are so important because so many people dismiss that little nudge or that little feeling that they might have. I think what you and I talked about is a lot of people know something's not quite right.
Yeah.
With their work journey, where they are, however you want to phrase that, they don't quite know what.
Yeah.
And they really need the space and the ability to really explore that and have that conversation and be brave and courageous about it. Because let's face it, leaving a job to go explore and find your passion is a scary proposition.
Yeah, it is.
You said you ripped the Band-Aid off. You definitely were
Mhm.
courageous. I shared with you, it's funny because as I just said that last sentence, that was true for me. I knew something wasn't quite right.
Yeah.
And I had already kind of made the decision that I need to be doing something else, but I didn't know what. I didn't know
Mhm.
how. And I
Yeah.
certainly didn't want to be chained to someone else kind of driving what that vision looked like and my
Yeah.
timeline and all those things. But it happened for me, if you want to call it that, because
Mm.
I thought I was stuck. And you and I talked a lot about that. And I want you to expand a little bit on that. And a coach said to me, "You're not as stuck as you think."
Mm.
And people do get tied to that paycheck, that steady income, which of course is important. But can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your feelings and how you help people kind of get to a different place with that to understand that there are other possibilities?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned your own journey because I I worked with a couple of different coaches during that period for me, and I think, like you mentioned, like having the space to say some of this stuff out loud that is mostly just swimming in our heads. There's a huge difference. Once you say out loud, I think I might want to do something else. Like it starts to get a little more real,
Yeah.
right? And then, and this is what I try to do with my own clients is, well, let's dig into that and see what's going on. What's underneath that? And for me, I focus a lot on helping people find their why and their purpose. And I think for me, it was true. And for a lot of folks, that's the piece that's often showing up, right? People
Yeah.
are, you know, good at their job often, quite
Yep.
good at it, been doing it
Yep.
for a long time, a lot of times, right? Um, but something has shifted, and usually it's alignment with our sense of purpose of
Mhm.
why we want to do things in the world.
Mhm.
So I have some assessments I work with, but I think a lot of it also comes from just questioning and asking people like what's different today than 5 years ago?
Yeah.
What changed for you? And I think that's a really important part of it is recognizing that the person we are at work is a full, complete person, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, we might look at our work journey and go, well, I'm still on the path. I just got promoted a couple of years ago, whatever.
Right.
But what's actually going on in your full life? And,
Yeah.
and that often shifts our things like our values and our purpose and that stuff. And that's where you can start to work through it. And do you have to always rip the Band-Aid off? No.
No.
I knew I was prepared to do it.
Mhm.
But there's dozens of different ways you can start to take steps. But I think the most important thing is that self-awareness of what's
Mhm.
actually causing me to feel misaligned.
Yeah, 100%. And I would agree with you that I think that you know, I think the way it shows up for a lot of people is that, but a lot of it it's like, what am I doing? What kind of impact am I having? And kind
Mm,
of that exploration of what kind of impact do I want to have? And
yeah.
that obviously comes back to your values and
Hmm.
getting close to them. But I think what's interesting is, first of all, I want to underscore what you said that you don't always have to rip the Band-Aid off, right? That's
Hmm.
part of it. You could,
Yeah.
but important, I think, for both of us to highlight that it's possible. For
Hmm.
me, they pushed me out the door. I didn't make the choice of when it would happen,
Yeah.
but really, in some sense, probably expressing that not wanting to work for somebody else and build my own thing so I had the autonomy to have the
Hmm.
impact I wanted to have and do what I wanted to do was part of me calling it to myself,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
part of the journey. So, but there's so many ways, that can show up. But I also think, and you and I were discussing this, this to me, this whole piece that we're just discussing right now, it really, because I work with companies, as you know, where I'm encouraging them to really have more alignment what their values are.
Yeah.
And in that, creating a culture that makes the work that that organization does have an impact, which in many ways can fulfill this individual,
Mm-hmm.
deficit or
Yeah.
void that people have. And you and I were talking about, these next generations that they want that, they
Oh, yeah.
need that, and it
Mm-hmm.
is also beneficial to the company
Yes.
because the value you get out of people when you're serving and feeding their
Mm-hmm.
purpose, their values, and they feel like they're part of something bigger is
Mm-hmm.
exponential. Do you, in your work with companies, discuss that? Do you feel that
Mm-hmm.
we're gaining traction and companies understanding that? I have my own opinion, but I'd love to hear yours.
I do, to answer it quickly. And I think I think as far as traction goes, I'd say it's mixed.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been some pendulum swinging happening. I mean, COVID kind of created a
Yeah.
really strong pendulum swing to the purpose and meaning and why am I even here? You have the great resignation because I think a lot of people were like, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that pendulum swung a little too far and had some people kind of just feeling completely lost.
Yeah.
And so I think it wanted to come back a little bit.
Yeah.
But I also think in certain places, certain industries, it's maybe swinging back a little further than I would like to see, where it's like, let's just all get back to work and just heads down, buckle down and show up. And even some of that hustle culture kind of vibe is showing up where I think the sweet spot is kind of what you were talking about, right? It's, if we get clear, if each individual is clear on what matters to them, our values, our purpose, or why, and the company is clear on it, well, then we can find ways to connect those dots, right? And it doesn't have to be my company is saving starving children or some grand vision like that. It can simply be, my company is helping companies, tell better stories about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for me, that's something that really matters. And I like telling stories and I like doing it through the lens of, my personal purpose, which is, maybe all about taking complex things and distilling them down into really simple bite-sized insights. Right.
Yeah.
And I think leadership in those kinds of companies can be really smart if they start to explore with their team what those things are that drive people and then showing them here's a path for you. Here's how you can not only show up in your own stuff, but how it makes a difference here. And I think that actually can have a multiplier effect in terms of how you feel about your work because you're personally fulfilled, but you're now also socially fulfilled, for lack of a better term, communally fulfilled,
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I would agree that it's kind of mixed as well. That's my opinion and my experience. And I think you're absolutely accurate that we started to have some traction. And then just because the, things that are happening are pushing us a little bit backwards, I think there's this sentiment, which I talk about very openly, like, there's this traditional business model that doesn't really necessarily work for all of this that we're talking about. But more importantly, for what companies are looking for and what leaders are looking for in terms of people who are truly engaged, who are truly loyal, who are truly committed. I hear leaders and CEOs all the time talking about how it's so hard to find people, so hard to find people who stay. Well, a lot of this has to do with it that you've got to acknowledge this holistic approach to the person who's coming to work for you.
Yeah.
And by the way, if people are getting aligned with their values, they're going to look for a company that is aligned with those values.
Yep.
And so we hear companies and CEOs talk about hiring. You want to make sure they fit your vision, that they match your values.
Yeah.
But are you really living those values in the work that you do? Because they're going to sniff that out really fast if it's just a performative, kind of looks good on the wall, looks good on paper kind of thing. So to me, it's crazy that this isn't kind of embedded and people don't get this because it's really so simple. But I think it's the traditional sense of business and economic hustle drive. We don't talk about feelings here. We don't talk about that here. That's kind of like the old Mad Men era kind of, type of workplace. And unfortunately, that still lingers. And I think that's the pushback that we're going back to. Let's get back to business,
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
you mentioned at the open, a holistic person, right? You've
Mhm.
gotta
Yeah.
be able to understand that person, and you as a person have to address those parts of you, because
Hmm.
we're not Stepford workers where we show up and we're very different, although sometimes we're forced to
Hmm.
be that way. We really have to
Yeah.
acknowledge and respond to all the parts of us that are important.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's an interesting tension in that you're uncovering, right? Because hiring is hard in the sense
Mhm.
that I don't think we have great processes for it. I don't think we
Right,
have great systems for it.
right.
Um, there is probably some more utopian version of the world where hiring and finding and connecting to people is so much easier. I think it's gotten better over the years because we have ways of getting to know people
Mhm.
through social media and stuff like that. But
Yep.
that also then uncovers the challenge of what you were talking about in terms of, are we being real, both on in
Mhm.
the individual side and on the company side, right? Because
True.
I think on the individual side, we certainly want to promote ourselves in a certain way. And okay, it's fair. I think you do. But what's really underneath that? Who are you really? And then when you
Mhm.
show up at a company, yeah, I mean, the values that show up on the website or on the wall, they might be real,
Right.
but you actually have to sort of confirm that they're real by looking at, like, one a guy who was on my podcast a couple of years ago. One of the things he said was culture is sort of a moving average of your last 60 days, how you showed up, how you treated people, how you led. And I thought that was a really poignant statement, right? Because yeah, we want to have integrity, or we want to be curious, or whatever those values are. But you got to look and go, are we doing it? And you can choose to then go, well, we're not doing well on those values and we need to do better. Or you could go, maybe that's not really a value. And that's okay.
Mhm.
Like, it's okay to realize maybe a value is not a value. And then kind of do the hard work of going, what's really true for us? And then I think there's something actually really wonderful, even though this is hard because hiring is hard, about discovering that maybe somebody's not the right fit, or you're
Yes.
not the right fit for a company. I mean, when
Yeah.
I coach people, and this is a tricky thing, right? You're coaching people sometimes on the company dime,
Mhm.
but part of what you're trying to do is really understand, is this person, does this person see a path for themselves here? And so some of the work we're talking about helps them do that. And one of the results of that work could be no.
Yeah.
And as a company and as a person, you should be grateful for that, even
Mhm.
though it might really suck in the moment. Um, a company does a lot better when people are aligned, and as a person, you're going to do a lot better when you feel aligned. So, I think being willing to get to that result is the only path to get to a place where most of your folks are aligned and feeling engaged and wanting to commit to what you want to commit to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said so much there that's so good. I'd like to unpack a little bit of that. You talked about hiring. Obviously, hiring is tough, right? And
Yeah.
the ability for people to show up real. Like we have that
Hmm.
problem in our culture where people don't feel safe to, and that's
Yeah.
only getting worse. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's my hope that we can continue to create spaces where people can show up as they are, because honestly, that's how you get the best out of them,
Yep.
period. And that's how
Hmm.
they are able to live fully. But I
Yeah.
also think, in terms of the value exploration, I think part of the issue is that a lot of companies take it as a marketing exercise,
Hmm.
not a marketing exercise.
Yeah.
It's lived
Hmm.
values. Now, unfortunately, I think culturally we have that problem as people too. A lot of
Yeah.
people claim to have values, but they're ones that sound good and they're not really living
Hmm.
them. So it's a daily exploration and assessment. We're human beings, we're not perfect. We all
Hmm.
step out of our out of those guardrails, if you will, right? And
Yeah.
we're questioned every single day on, are we living our values? But you do
Hmm.
the best you can and you course correct, or you
Hmm.
reassess, you know?
Yeah.
But I think if a company does the work correctly, not from a marketing standpoint, they'll be pretty close because they're an extension of what the leaders, owners, and obviously ownership is important. But you have big corporations that are backed by private equity, and then that gets super messy, right? But
Yeah.
to the best of their ability, really identifying what truly matters and why they do what they do.
Yeah.
Now, if it's simply to make money, that's probably not going to hold a lot of weight for the new generations and even our generation that are at this enlightened state where we're like, I want more. Right?
Yeah.
But obviously, and I want to make this really clear, it's possible. They're not mutually exclusive, making money and having impact. They go together.
Yeah.
They actually complement one another very nicely.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing I want to say on this is that if you've done the work well as a company, in terms of hiring, you are going to attract the people who are a match. Because just like marketing, if you will, where it's done well and it's authentic and it's real, people say, I want that.
Yeah.
They want to be a part of that. So it's going to attract those people that align, and it's going to, more often than not always, obviously, and it's going to repel the ones who don't. So it's a great exercise for a company to do, and one that I guide many companies through that have done the kind of dabbling and marketing exercises before. It takes work, it takes commitment. And you have to live it every single day and make sure that all your leadership all the way down is living that and breathing that as part of who they are and who you are as a company. So that's a lot that we just talked about, but the impact is twofold for the company and for the person, right? And for the people. So I'm super passionate about getting people to see that. And getting businesses to see the flaws in not doing that or the cost of not doing that. But, I think it's going to be something that we have to continue to talk about and bring to the surface to push that change to happen.
Yeah. I mean, a couple things that you said there are really interesting. I mean, the idea of values as a marketing exercise is probably how maybe most companies do it. And, having worked in advertising and marketing and branding, I mean, your core values is a part of the branding exercise. Now, what you brought up later, I think, is the key part. It should be true.
Yes.
And the best marketing is true, right? I mean, you can kind of get by if your marketing isn't true, but usually the sustainable brands are the ones that actually live up to their values, or at least try to enough. And when they don't, they course correct, as you said. Doing that exercise as a branding and marketing exercise can be useful if you're embracing it through the lens of, we want to show up as our true selves, and therefore attract customers who want a piece of that, and then ultimately attract employees and team members and other leaders who want a part of that. I think there's a little bit of this Instagram effect kind of a thing where we surface level a lot of stuff, both personally and as brands. And again, I think about the stuff you're really drawn to on Instagram or social media are usually the people who have cut through because they say that's a bunch of BS. And I want to show you something deeper. I want to show you who I am. Now, maybe it still has good lighting and still has some things to make it look nice, but not always. And ultimately, I think people are just craving, probably more than ever with AI and everything, like genuine human contact, connection, understanding, truth. And that's, that is going to be the way forward, I think, probably more so than ever.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a lot of discussion about that right now, right? In the age of AI and all of that, creativity and being real and authentic and, not faked. It's like, you use the word scratch the surface, right? Like anybody who's used Chat GPT knows that the first iteration of something is like,
Yeah.
really, like just so
Uh-huh.
thin and so shallow.
Yeah.
And so when I think about that, and to use an analogy, when people are operating in life that way, or
Hmm.
companies are operating in life that way, we talked about companies, you know, doing their values as a marketing exercise. That's
Yeah.
just the surface level thing that looks good, right? And that's
Hmm.
kind of like the mode of business that really doesn't work, like doing things that
Yeah.
look good on paper. But I would agree that we are craving that now, and that's only going to grow
Yeah.
because I think that, how do I put this well? I think that people are still attracted to the things that look good, right?
Hmm.
As you said, but
Yeah.
they're kind of like the bright and shiny things that get your
Yeah.
attention, and then you lose interest pretty
Hmm.
quickly.
Yeah.
If you're a company, I don't think that's what you want, right? You want the tried and true, you want the loyalty. And by the way, what we didn't talk about is consumers are also, there's this rising consumerism
Hmm.
where people, and I'm proudly one of these people, where I will only do business with companies that are aligned with my values.
Yeah.
And if I've made a mistake in judging one, and then they show something that is not aligned with their values, that this might be performative, that this might
Yeah.
be something that they just said and don't truly believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I think everything we're saying just begs the question, when are they going to get on the bus? You know?
Yeah. This is a good question. I mean, I think, the challenging part of that question is that um, I think with sort of like, guts and willpower, you
Yeah.
can kind of try to steamroll your way through a lot of this stuff by doing things sort of the wrong way, being a little more surface level, and just trying to like cram your company down people's throats and just try to do it that way and the same way with your team. And for some folks, if and you mentioned, going back to Mad Men era and maybe even longer, like it's so built into our memory and our DNA as business people. Like you just become a part of that. It's hard to, even if you want to not become a part of it, you come into a culture
Yes.
where that momentum is there.
Yes.
You just kind of ride the wave. So the
Yes.
harder thing to do sometimes is to kind of stand up and kind of resist the wave and kind of, raise that flag a little bit and go, there's actually a better way here. We don't have to just continually sort of like getting carried through this constant barrage of, you know, unsustainable stuff here. We can do something different, but it takes a moment, right? And that's, I mean, I can say this even, working with people as a coach, not everybody's ready to take that moment, right? It's like, it's a little easier to just stay on the bus, right? So, you have to be willing to do that. And that I think ultimately comes down to, I think with a company, the top leadership has to be open to doing that deeper dive work and not just from a company perspective, but from themselves. Do I want to
100.
lead
Yeah.
this kind of company? Is that really what I'm here for? Particularly if you've gotten a few gray hairs on you and you're kind of like taking that second look at your life. And maybe when you were in your 30s or even 40s, you're like, I could do that. But now that you're getting a little older, you're like,
Yeah.
I don't know that's who I want to be anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's so you said there was so much goodness in that, but you said a lot of things there, like really understanding and having the courage, and this, it takes a moment or somebody to stand up, and I talk about that all the time, right? Are you going to stand up? Like, let's
Yeah.
do, there's such a climate for yes, men and women. I'm going to say men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
like, I'm like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, like, I'm not going to go along with this because this is the model. And you see so many people, you said, step in, and like it's easier sometimes to just fall in. And
Yeah.
sometimes people will go in saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show up as myself, but it's so powerful. I talk
Oh
about that
yeah.
all the time, just in society too, right? We have all these
Mm-hmm.
boxes. If you're a football mom, you have to be this way. If you're a business person, you have to be this way. If you're a CEO,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be this way. If you're a,
Yep.
whatever. And fitting these boxes where there might be a better way. And we're all just kind of, you know, just replicating this bad model.
Yeah.
that doesn't serve us. None of us,
No.
and it
Mm-mm.
doesn't serve individuals, doesn't serve companies, doesn't serve society,
Yeah.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
So it does take a moment, and not everybody's ready. I would agree with that. But I also know enough about the way people behave that the more we bring that norm of saying, there's a better way, and I'm going to stand up and say it instead of saying yes and falling in line, the more momentum we build and the safer space we build for people to feel the courage to do that. I mean, we talk
Mm-hmm.
about culture in companies. That's part of the challenge, is making the space safe enough for people to show up as they are.
Yeah.
Not, I have to wear the blue suit, I have to say this and not say that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot there, right?
Yeah. But
But I think, and I keep looking at the door because where I record here, it's Bravery Studios, and I'm in
okay.
the courage room, right?
Yeah.
It takes courage. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
can we, as coaches, leaders, people, mentors, give people the ability to have the courage to do it
Mm-hmm.
differently, to
Yeah.
say no, to say, I think there's a better way.
Mm.
You and I talked a lot about this next generation, Gen Z, coming up, and
Yeah.
they approach things kind of differently, where they
They
are not
do.
going to take
Yeah.
it. They are not going to kind of take things as they are. Let's talk about that a little bit, and that generation, and what we
Mm.
can learn from them. And also, I'd love to dive into some of what you and I talked about in the pre-chat about how to help them find their purpose and their why.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something really interesting that you're uncovering there, right? Because what you described, being willing to stand up, say no, I mean, in some ways, that's a really beautiful definition of leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a company, when somebody stands up and says no, that can feel like resistance. And yet, you and I both work with people who say, I want leaders. I want people to show up as leaders. And it's like, well, sort of be careful what you wish for, because
Mm-hmm.
you may get people who stand up and say, no, there's a better way. And so, I think as companies, you need to find a way to invite that energy in, create that safety for it.
Yes.
And then because, as, more senior leaders, you might have more experience in how to show up with that energy. You can guide and mentor people, and you can work with coaches like us, and you can do all kinds of stuff to help people figure out, how can I do that productively? How can I do that in a way where people will listen to me, right? Somebody shows up and they're a year into their job and they start waving their arms like, this is all crazy and we need to fix it all. I don't know that everybody's going to listen, right? I think people might notice, but if they do it in a way that says like, with maybe a blend of the sort of wide-eyed optimism that wonders what else could be done, but with I don't quite want to call it humility because that sounds a little too squashed for me, but with a recognition that maybe they don't know it all yet, and say, here's what I see. And this is the benefit of me being a younger person in your company, new, experiencing things on the ground. Here's what I see. And here's what I see as a smart human that could be ways of fixing this. Please tell me what you see, and let's talk about it. And I think, to kind of follow up on your last part of the question of like helping those younger folks kind of find their why and their purpose, I think it can often start in those conversations by realizing that you can show up and you can do so in a way that people are really listening to you and are engaged with you. I think there's a potential for a really beautiful sort of cycle of learning that can happen there. But currently, a lot of our companies are just not set up for that. It's the old way was, you got to pay your dues and you got to have at least 10 years under you before you even open your mouth about that stuff. And I think we don't have time for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think you're wrong, obviously, but I think it's another missed opportunity, right? And I'll say this, I won't say that in this. Part of my listeners probably heard me talk about this. I spent 20 years in corporate America, and I did always go against the grain. I was labeled a troublemaker many times,
Mm-hmm.
but it was because I was not going to accept status quo. Well, that's the way we've always done it, and if I saw a better way, I wanted to articulate it. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that the younger generation or somebody who's not as senior, I think that's the challenge, but it's absolutely necessary work for leaders inside the culture to model that and to give them the language of this is how we present our own ideas. Give them the
Mm-hmm.
language and give them model that for this is how we do this. I don't agree and here's why. Maybe I don't understand XYZ, but
Yeah.
maybe there's another way. I don't know. Like creating, and also, creating that forum for that,
Mm-hmm.
because I've seen so many really talented, smart people fall in line and say yes and go
Mm-hmm.
along with something that they knew was a terrible way to move forward.
Yeah.
Let's say, okay, it could be anything. I
Mm-hmm.
also have seen people fall in line to sacrifice their own values.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you are not going to get the best out of somebody if something that you're doing at the company is not aligned with their values. Those are those conversations that it's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, maybe this isn't a fit, But and I think that's data. That's a data point for a company. Like, why did we
Mm-hmm.
lose this person? Like,
Yeah.
not, oh, see ya, good riddance. No, why did we? Because that could be a test of, hey, maybe we've lost our way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think to the more important point here of articulating this, I think leadership has to value, and good leadership isn't saying yes and being a yes man and no
Right.
dissension. It's
Mm-hmm.
challenge and be able to articulate what your ideas and different ways to solve problems are. But obviously, creating that environment where people feel the ability to do that, part of that is modeling the language, how we do it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and that only happens by people in higher positions doing that and teaching the people that are coming in to do
Yeah.
that, as that's the mode of operation. This is the way we talk here.
Yeah.
There's not one good or great leader that doesn't value that.
Yeah.
And I'm
Mm-hmm.
serious about that, right? We want contrarian,
Mm-hmm.
approaches. We want that. That's how we get innovation. That's how we change
Mm-hmm.
things.
Yeah.
That's how we move forward. And, if it's a process idea, a product idea, obviously people can get their hands around that better. But if it's a
Mm-hmm.
culture and a interpersonal way, how
Yeah.
do we operate here?
Mm-hmm.
I think that has to be taken seriously too, because we're dealing with human beings, right?
We are, despite I think our best efforts to make it seem like we're not. Like so many companies, it's like we sort of try to just cover our eyes and go like, oh no, those aren't people around me. Those are just roles, and those are just sort of avatars for the thing I'm trying to get done, or they're in my way. And I think your point about modeling the language is so important. And I think one thing I've noticed with a lot of folks is how important the importance of one-on-ones with your team, and having those one-on-ones be more of what you're talking about, versus what I noticed for some folks is it's more of like the checklist. Did you get this done? Did you get this done? Where's the status? Blah, 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 blah. Those things are important, but they can also usually be done in an email. Yeah. Right. But the ongoing conversation of how can I continue to support you and showing up in the best possible way to support us is exactly that conversation. And asking people, inviting people, what are you noticing? What are you seeing? What could we be doing better? And being really, this is where humility really comes in as a leader, being humble enough to hear it. Yeah. And so if somebody goes, I think the way we do that thing is just strange. What doesn't even make sense? And to kind of go like, okay, tell me more. Right. Like it makes sense to me maybe, but like I could have been swallowed up in the culture already. And it just makes sense because I'm in it. You have fresh eyes. I want to hear it, but there's risk. I mean, I think as leaders, the scary part is I think we want to have some ability to hold on to what we've built. And if somebody is poking at that, the fear is it's all just going to come crumbling down. So how do you?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I totally get that. I think though that, and I didn't say this earlier when you were talking about, having the ability as a leader to look at yourself, like that is that's like leadership 101. If you are not a self-aware human being, you're not a good leader. You
Yeah.
can't be,
Mm-hmm.
because you've got to be able to hold the mirror up to yourself and be able to hear,
Yeah.
okay, you didn't do very well, or this is what you did, or whatever. And
Yeah.
you actually got to say those things to yourself before somebody else says them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in terms of, I could think of so many examples in terms of like holding on to what you built, like, just one company is coming to mind that, they were so entrenched on this 4-generation company, holding on to the way things had been done
Mm.
and thinking that they were superior because they were at one time,
Mm-hmm.
and got knocked, and people were talking and kind of trying to bring this to the leadership
Yeah.
about the competition. The competitive landscape has changed. People
Mm-hmm.
don't Companies are not going to spend like the Cadillac price tag of what our product is.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably going to entertain something a little more disposable that costs less.
Yeah.
And they didn't listen. And it
Mm.
got them in a lot of financial trouble that I don't know if they'll recover from.
Yeah.
So I get it. But in terms of a leader holding on to what they built, it's almost like if I don't entertain that there might be a better way and something new and different that I didn't understand,
Mm-hmm.
that might be the end of your empire anyway. So
No.
especially in these times, like,
Yeah.
we are not in the age, many times companies actually, I think, acknowledge that this is a short-term thing and we're going to ride the wave, and when it's done, it's done.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's part of a whole niche,
Yeah. There's a
business
whole
model
world. Yeah.
sometimes, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I don't think most people who start a company go, and build it and scale it, or big companies, that have been
Mm-hmm.
around forever, see that as part of their legacy, right? They
Yeah.
want to sustain, and with that, they have to evolve.
Yeah.
So, in order to hear those things, the leaders have to be self-aware and have to
Mm.
welcome that. They don't have to agree,
Yeah.
right? But they've got to create the space where they can hear it, take it as a data point,
Mm-hmm.
and entertain it and be
Yeah.
curious about it instead of shutting it down. That's when you
Yeah.
have the yes men. They're like, nope, nope, nope,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
No, I agree.
I mean, I think that it's an interesting point, and there's so much to unpack there with that, but it's important to everything we've been discussing about this, because it's, you're dealing with humans as a leader, but you're a human too. So how do you
Yeah.
evolve, and how do you show up as your best self? It's by
Mm-hmm.
doing these things that create this evolution and awareness, and willingness to change, and willingness to change your mind.
Yeah.
The other thing we have a deficit of these days. People are holding on for dear life to their opinion.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like, no, you got to think about your thinking. Like, right?
I
Think about
know.
your thinking. You present it with new data, you can change your mind.
Yeah. There's something interesting in that, right? I mean, I think under stress, maybe we cling a little harder,
True.
but I also think what you're mentioning about, like, well, if you don't change your organization, your company may just go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe the question here is, like, what do we want to endure? As a company. And I think that maybe comes back to values, at least as part of the piece. Maybe there's a mission or a vision for something. And not that any of those things can't shift, but they're a little less open to just constantly swapping in and out, while the products and the process and, the ways we deal with people maybe can be a little more ever evolving. But I think as long as we have something that we can hold on to and feel like, okay, we're still that, because I do think, the companies that last probably have something at their core that they're holding on to,
100%.
even if how it shows up changes.
That's their North Star, right?
Yeah.
And that's like, we're really articulating this here, that conditions change, objectives change. The business plan you wrote last year, or even the, in October of 2024, is very different now.
Yep.
Because of the economic things that are going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
US side and globally as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, but your values and your core values, that's your North Star to go back to help you make decisions to hold on to.
Yeah.
But again, it can't be this performative marketing thing. It has to be
Yeah.
true and real. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
grounds you.
Yeah.
Just like people,
Mm-hmm.
that should be your center, if you will.
Yeah.
But
Agreed.
well, I would love to get into the conversation, about this next generation. And we brought up Gen Z. You and I, when we talked in the pre chat, we talked about, finding your purpose and
Mm-hmm.
finding your why. And you and I both talked about where we are in life,
Yeah.
right? And many
Mm-hmm.
people who are at the same stage as us, you have this wisdom and this experience and this hindsight, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that you've gained only by the journey that you're on. And I bet
Mm-hmm.
you and I probably both said this, but if you had talked to your 20-year-old self or 21-year-old self, you wouldn't have told them all the things that you've now done or the path and where it led you and all of the
Yeah.
curves of the road. You wouldn't have even known that was going to come.
Mm-hmm.
So we are at an advantage at this stage of life to have
Mm-hmm.
that hindsight and that wisdom.
Yeah.
Um, we talked about that they won't accept kind of the way things as they are, and they ask why a lot more, which is
Yeah.
great. But how do we reframe for this younger generation finding your why or finding your purpose and the value in the journey of that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, a couple things come to mind. I mean, I think the first thing that can actually sort of take the pressure off is realizing two things. One, that your why doesn't have to be some giant thing,
I love
right?
that.
That your why can simply be like, I'm really good at solving problems, or I'm really good at connecting people, or whatever, right? It can be just this core truth about who you are.
Hmm.
And then I think in tandem with that, it doesn't have to be permanent
Right.
either. And that I think gets to your point about the journey and exploring and being curious and being open to what experiences are going to tell you. I think you try to kind of find that line of like, okay, you've lived 20 years, 22 years, whatever it is. What's stuck with you so far? And it can be helpful to ask some questions around that. When are you most kind of lit up around things? When are you most happy? What kinds of people do you find yourself drawn to?
Yeah.
Um, Even if you're working at a company, like what got you excited about this job? It may be that it was one thing. It's like, okay, that may be at least part of your why or who you are right now.
Yeah.
But I think to your point, embracing this idea that, okay, I'm going to lean into that. I'm going to see where it goes. And I'm going to be open to the fact that it might shift. It might magnify. It might be like, oh my God, I am so into this problem solving thing. This is all I ever want to do. And you may do
Hmm.
that for the next 20 years.
Hmm.
Um, and I think to do that, I think the instinct to ask why about a lot of things is wonderful because that's like a quick path to learning. I work with some younger folks in my coaching practice, and some kind of have that innately, and others are kind of like maybe a little shyer or something like that.
Hmm.
And it's like it's in there,
Yeah.
but they want to know like how I can actually say these things. I can
Hmm.
ask my boss about these things, or I can offer my opinion, or I can say this feels weird. Why is it that way?
Yeah.
And what I would say from the standpoint of older, grayer self is that's one thing I would tell my younger self. Dude, you got to ask more questions right away. You got to be like, they're in your head, get them out.
Yeah.
Like it's better to find out that you're on a slight detour on your path right now than
Yeah.
to maybe get stuck. It took me a few years to kind of embrace that. And then I did, but
Yeah.
I think starting that, I mean, I'd go back to my high school self and tell
Yeah.
them, try to do that a little bit,
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting and, the parallels for me are kind of profound here is that, we're talking about, we just closed that other section about companies and core values and really being connected to that, and that's your North Star. It really is the same in this conversation. It's really
Yeah.
framing it and having the, prompts or, working with young people and having them be exposed to that this is a journey. Identify what's important to you.
Yeah.
What are you good at? What do you
Mm-hmm.
really like to do? Not, oh, I want to be an engineer at this, blah, blah, blah. I
Right.
like to help people. I
Mm-hmm.
like to solve problems. I love figuring things out.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much more value in that because that is central. And then also so much more opportunity because there's so many more paths to that purpose. And I had a
Mm-hmm.
young girl who I interviewed here on an episode, and she actually had ADHD and had a very not good experience in school and thought she was
Mm-hmm.
never going to have a career.
Yeah.
And the conversation we had with her was that she started to say, okay, wait a minute. What am I good at? And what do I like to do? She did exactly that, but really from a
Mm-hmm.
perspective of what are my strengths? Because she
Mm-hmm.
knew she had some weaknesses in some areas. They were pointed
Yeah.
out her whole life in school.
Mm-hmm.
And her strengths were she likes to figure things out and she loves to help people.
Mm.
And so she leaned into those strengths,
Yeah.
which then opened up all these different opportunities. One that she ended up working in a career that she never thought she'd be in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really powerful thing to help and mentor and coach and,
Mm-hmm.
start those conversations for young people. And
Yeah.
maybe not even just young people,
Yeah.
because somebody
Mm-hmm.
could be 20 years into their working career and have never had this
Oh,
dialogue
yeah.
with themselves or,
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity to kind of question that.
Yeah.
I think that is so powerful. And you and I talked about that it doesn't have to be this big giant thing like this macro level,
Mm-hmm.
save the planet, which is
Right.
great if that's what you want to do.
Of course.
But it can be helping people, challenging the status quo,
Yeah.
like,
Absolutely.
solving problems, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's so many more ways to that. I think I also mentioned in our pre-chat, and I just thought of it as we were talking about this, my own nephew he's now 35 years old, 36,
Yeah.
35. And he went to school for something and didn't end up doing so well in school, and then couldn't get to he was going to be a physical therapist and couldn't get into physical therapy schools and didn't have the money for it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, what am I going to do now? And worked a job. Like, that's an important thing. Like, he worked a
Yeah.
job that he knew he wasn't going to be in his whole life, but it's like, okay, let me just do this and figure it
Mm-hmm.
out.
Yeah.
And however he came to it, one of the things he says now is, I like helping people. And he ended up going into law enforcement as a state
Yeah.
trooper. But
Wow.
that was the reason why. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to go into law enforcement. I'm going to be in criminal justice. No, it was like, I want to help people. What are all the paths
What are the pathways?
that I
Yeah.
can do that?
Mm.
And that's just one real example that he kind of got to the what do I like to do
Mm-hmm.
to what am I going to do that way, instead of the opposite, which we train kids to do, right? We train everybody to do. What are you going to do? What do you want
Oh
to
my
do when you
gosh.
grow up?
I know. I was always baffled by that question because I really didn't know. I just always kind of said, I'm going to be a business person or something, and the kids who knew they wanted to be doctors or lawyers or even go into law enforcement I was always kind of jealous. I'm like, how did you know that already? But they probably did a little bit of what you're talking about. They kind of
might have.
probably understood themselves a little better.
Something clicked for them, right?
Yeah. And there's something you mentioned about the strengths that I wanted to touch on, because I think we maybe take for granted as we get a little older and we've heard some feedback that everybody just kind of knows what they're good at. And like when you're 21, 22, you have no idea, especially in the context of work, because you haven't had to apply it in that way. So one, taking that chance to look at yourself and try to notice, like, what am I energized by and what do I seem to have a little less struggle with? But then getting that feedback from somebody to go like, what are you noticing that I'm doing well here? And again, it might be like, well, you're really good working with people. You just seem to care about people in a way that not everybody has. And like that is this amazing gift at that point in life to then go, let me explore that more. Let me see where that takes me. And also just the simple validation of like, I'm in this weird, confusing world of work that you lose sight of once you've been in it for a while, how weird it is.
Very true.
And now I have a way of connecting to it. Now I have a way of feeling like I'm actually contributing to it, because I remember my first job out of college, I didn't know what I was doing. And I just didn't and I never really got there. Honestly, I just ended up like finding my way and ultimately getting to advertising. But it was like the simple question of how do I add value here?
Mm-hmm.
It was not clear to me. I did
Yeah.
the things, the
Yeah.
spreadsheets and whatever else they wanted me to do. But
Yeah.
like, what piece of me could I bring?
Yeah.
No idea.
Well, and I think, in general, and this is like we're going back to this big, societal issue that we have, right? It's like asking, what do you want to be, and what we do in this country where we so tie up our identity and what we do and who,
Mm-hmm.
what job we have. It
Yeah.
really shouldn't be that way, right? It's like
Yeah.
it should be, and even I'm going to be started on this one. When older people then say to younger people, you should do what you're passionate about.
Yeah, that's not helpful either.
That's not helpful.
No.
Okay? That's not helpful. Now,
No.
I would agree if you're passionate about helping people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But like where we end up confusing, getting that confused is then the context for that is we think, okay, what am I passionate about? Well, I like to fish.
Right.
There
I like to
might
play
not
video
be
games.
a future in that. Okay.
Right.
Like that's
Yeah.
terrible advice.
Mm-hmm.
But I would agree if we reframe the questions to what are your strengths or what are you passionate about having an impact? How are you passionate about having impact? And what did you just say? How did you say it?
How do I add value to the world?
How to add value. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the important questions to identify
Yeah.
those core things that are then the center to guide you in so many different ways that you can
Mm-hmm.
fulfill that and
Yeah.
be connected to that. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, the passion question is tough because, there's a slice of people for whom like I'm passionate about playing the cello and then they become a cellist. Like it does happen, but
of course.
but I think most of us it is more of like just getting clear on what gives me energy in the world, what I get excited about, what I've found that I'm kind of good at, or at least could be good at. Like I'm starting to scratch the surface and I'm like, the more I do that, the better I get at it. Okay. Let's mix all that up and see where that can take me. And again, it doesn't have to all be figured out
Yeah.
at 21. I mean, I think that's the other challenge.
That is the other challenge, right? Is allowing, obviously, I have a young son that'll graduate from school soon, and you want them to have a direction,
Sure.
but it is a journey, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to have it figured out on day, 2,569. Like
Mm-hmm.
it can be a progression that moving you towards things, but having that exploration and that curiosity about all the things you said, what lights me up, what do I enjoy, why do I enjoy it,
Mm-hmm.
what do I like to do, what are my strengths, all those things to
Mm-hmm.
help guide that exploration.
Yep.
I think that's so important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this has been a blast, TJ.
Likewise, yeah.
I love this conversation. I think these conversations are important for people to hear, for people not only who are on this journey, whether they're our age or they're younger, but also to help us support each other in creating these conversations
1000%.
and highlighting them. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope
Thank
that
you.
if you're listening or watching, you've enjoyed our conversation. I'm going to connect all the information about TJ in the show notes. If you want to reach out to him, check out his podcast as well as all his socials. So thank you again, TJ. I really appreciate you being here, and I value this conversation.
Likewise. Thanks, Maria. It was awesome.
Thank you so much. We will see you on the next episode of Finding the Upside. Bye for now.